All right. Hello? All right, hi everyone. So I'd like to start off on one very important point. Mark Miles is a Wabash grad. Despite this, he's gone on to have a very successful career. Mark began his career in politics and worked for an Indianapolis mayoral campaign as well as several Indiana congressional campaigns. After working in politics, Mark started his own marketing firm. In 1984, he was asked to lead the organizing committee for the 1987 Pan American Games. As president of the organizing committee, Mark oversaw and managed the event's $100 million budget and 30,000 volunteers. After this, he served as the executive director of corporate relations for Eli Lilly, where he was in charge of managing Lilly's lobbying efforts both in states and on the federal level. All of these experiences kind of segued perfectly into one of his next big ventures as head of the ATP Tour. Mark served as the CEO for the newly formed ATP Tour, which for non-tennis fans is the official organizing body of men's professional tennis. He served as the CEO for the ATP for 15 years before moving to his current role as president and CEO of the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. At the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, Mark facilitates strategic economic growth through work in concert with local CEOs, university presidents, and government leaders. Most recently, Mark served as the chairman of the board for the Indianapolis Super Bowl Host Committee after successfully organizing the bid for Indianapolis to host Super Bowl 46 in 2008. Please give a warm welcome to Mark Miles.
Thanks, Andrew. Can you hear me? This is working? Good. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I always, I have two sons currently at DePauw, and I can't be here without somebody saying I'm a Wabash grad. And I serve on your board of visitors where I feel a little bit like I imagine Benedict Arnold must have felt. But it's a pleasure to have so much time here in Greencastle and to know DePauw better. I'm a little nervous about following Andrew Kahn to a podium. And the guy is just totally jinxed. That's all there is to it. He's had 2 hip surgeries and now buggered his ankle yesterday. So I'm going to try to stay steady and keep my joints intact during this presentation. Already, the Super Bowl was in February 5th this past year. Many of you would have known about it. Hopefully some of you got to come have fun in it, but it's already sort of fading and for some of us seems almost like some kind of surreal fading memory. But I think it had the desired effect on a lot of fronts, and so while I'm really eager for it to be totally in the rearview mirror and get back to kind of a normal life, it is appropriate and it's fun once in a while to kind of look back and talk a little bit about what happened. So the purpose of this is to give you a sense of the challenge we faced as a community as we looked at the possibility and then ultimately had the responsibility of organizing the Super Bowl in a pretty unusual context. We were not a normal selection. There were lots of big differences between Indianapolis and most Super Bowl host cities. The first and in some ways the most important, I think, was the layout of the city. When I'd been to lots of Super Bowls, in part in the 4 years since we got the bid and before ours actually happened, and for a couple years before that, and a couple years just as a person whose life was in sports. And almost always, they are very spread out. If you go to Phoenix, you're in Scottsdale and Glendale and all the suburbs, and everything you want to do is an hour away. And, I always used to say you could land in the Phoenix airport and not know what's happening in this city. And it's just the way it is. They're spread out. The same's true in North Florida, where it goes from South Beach all the way up to the northern end of Broward County in Fort Lauderdale. Everything is somewhere else. Everything's a long way away. The same's true in North Texas, where Dallas had it. It's Dallas and it's Fort Worth and it's any number of political jurisdictions. Everything's spread out, which for us deflates things. Based on our experiences in sports and other things, when you can bring people together, you can create a special ambiance. So We thought it was a great opportunity, but it's also this density. Everything is downtown in Indianapolis and walkable, creates major logistical challenges. The plus side of having a football stadium out in the middle of Glendale with vast land around it is staging areas for the halftime show stuff and logistics and television production and all those things that where space isn't a premium became complicated for us. So unusual in that regard. The weather was not unique. The prospects of cold weather were not unique. The Super Bowl has been in a few northern cities in the past, but was unusual. In fact, I've told this story to a couple of the PA kids who were J-term interns at the Super Bowl, but I'll tell it again. We were preparing the bid document, and this is really tedious. The NFL sends cities that wish to compete to bid to ultimately get the right to host the game. They send you this bid document, and in and of itself is an inch thick, and it's just page after page of kind of fill-in-the-blank essay answer. How will you do this? What do you bring to the table? And many of us had been at it, night after night. It's 1 in the morning. We got a few days left before we got to finalize it and print it and turn it in. And we flip to the section that says championship golf courses. Please list your area's championship golf courses and stipulate any charges for the NFL and its stakeholders. And we looked at each other and just said, damn. They don't really want to come to a cold weather city in February. They're not serious. But because it was late at night and we were delirious, we listed all the great golf courses in Indianapolis and said no charge at the bottom of the page. We really wanted to see if they read the thing. But the point really is it's unusual, and there's a strong kind of bias against cold weather cities in favor of warm weather cities in the NFL Super Bowl committee. It's unusual but completely positive that we have Unigov, so the whole city is the county, the whole county is the city in Indianapolis. It means you don't have a bunch of different political, law enforcement, permitting, and other government jurisdictions, which complicate your life when you're trying to get something like this done. We had one set of government, if you will, city and state, two, and the community had done countless major events, so this is a drill that's pretty practiced and pretty seamless. Different, but an advantage for us. Small city, for us that meant really there's stress particularly on two things: hotels. We had something like 9,000 downtown sort of Class A hotel rooms. It's not enough, but nowhere can you go in one, maybe New York, one downtown space. But we don't have a lot of really first-rate hotels after you get out of the downtown and a couple of spots around 465. So the block of hotels was like 150 hotels and got probably to Putnam County and certainly to Tippecanoe County, Lafayette, and all around. A small market challenge. The other was downtown seats in restaurants. We were worried that there wouldn't be enough places for people who weren't being entertained as part of the corporate family to just go in and get dinner and drinks, especially because so many private parties go on and take a lot of the inventory off the top before the guy on the street fan has the chance. And I wasn't worried about this, but I'm sure folks at the NFL recognized that we were unusual because we were uninitiated. We hadn't done it before. And most of the time, the game sort of alternates between, California and Arizona, and Texas hopes to get in that mix. At least Houston has been, and Florida. So unusual. This slide just talks about kind of your starting point. How do you think about how to get organized? Because it's a blank slate. The league doesn't hand you a manual that says, here's everything that's required of you, and here's exactly how you do it, and when you do it, and what it'll cost. So it's an interesting planning process you've got some parameters, but largely kind of a blank slate, clean canvas thing. You got to figure out how you want to be structured legally, what kind of corporate entity you're going to have. You got to figure out, we didn't spend a lot of time on this slide, but sort of the vision, or mission, depending on how you look through the nomenclature for business strategy planning, the strategy, the key goals. What's our sense of what we're trying to do here? Which sort of powers all the rest of the detailed planning. We decided, and it wasn't novel for us, the Pan Am Games were in 1987. That event is the same as the Summer Olympic Games. There are actually more events leading to the awarding of a medal in the Pan Am Games than in the Olympics. So incredibly complex. 28 events. You got all the practice venues for the competition. You've got all the countries of the Western Hemisphere, languages, et cetera. For that, we decided to use a kind of, the management was largely volunteers who were committee chairmen. And the reasons were, in part, by not having to hire everybody, we could use the most talented people in the community who would volunteer to take a committee leadership role while they kept their day job. They were volunteers in their extra time, spent a lot of time. So we got great talent we couldn't have possibly hired on a short-term basis. And also, when you get lots of people involved, it promotes itself. These are ambassadors in the community that talk about what they're involved in with their families and friends and wherever they go. So this was not a new model, but we decided the same thing. This would be kind of volunteer-driven. There ended up being, I think, 60 committees organized into groups that were called divisions. If there were 60 committees, there were something like 160 committee chairs. So there were co-chairs for each committee. Very redundant, defies a lot of the basic principles of organization. There's a lack of accountability, et cetera, et cetera. But it got more people involved, and we had a 4-year window, and we knew some people would get transferred out of town, some maybe would wash out due to a waning interest and what have you. And again, we have this ethos that we want as many people involved as possible, and as much talent thinking about it as possible. So we had to figure out what a committee structure would look like and begin to recruit for that. How do you staff paid folks? We ended up with, I think, about, not including interns, 29 people maybe, and most of that in the last year. Their role really is to coordinate the planning of the volunteer committee leadership and the budgeting and the controls, and then make sure it's all happening. It's a kind of quality control switchboard function. How do you do a budget? The league, again, doesn't hand you the requirements. You're not told how much it's going to cost. So you have to really think carefully about that. You try to learn what you can from other prior host cities, but they're very apples and oranges kinds of comparisons, so a real challenge. We began to recruit some national partners. That's to fund the budget for the national and local. And a few key things had to be put in place early on. So the budget. We ended up thinking that it was going to cost us $25 million to fund our obligations, the commitments we made to the league. There's some other stuff I'll get to that's outside that and much more expensive. But we sort of set a budget of $25 million. And then we thought, we were bidding in May of '08. So, you know, the economy is starting, but not quite yet going into free fall. We thought it'd be a good idea to have all the money in the bank before we bid. So that's not literally true, but what we did do is we went to what became 130 companies that decided to make gifts. Might as well have been charitable contributions. They got zero benefits. No marketing rights, no licenses. They were being good corporate citizens. It to them wasn't any different than if they were given to the United Way or some other human services function. They did it because they believed it was good citizenship and that the game would be good for community development. So we ended up asking for pledges, and in the end it was more like $27 million that came in through these corporate citizens. But we could go to the owners when we pitched and made our presentation in the bidding process and say, this has never happened before and it may never happen again, but we're here having it already fully funded. New Orleans has the next Super Bowl. New Jersey, New York has it after that. They're both still trying to raise the money to fully fund their budgets. So this was important to us. These bid requirements, this is sort of the two buckets of the 28 funds. The bid requirements are things that are pretty clearly stipulated but not costed out by the league in the application process, the bidding process. And the stuff under host cities are kind of add-ons. Things we wanted to do that the league, frankly, did not require, and we didn't much care whether the league cared about them or not. They were things we wanted to do for our community as part of the process of having all this energy and excitement, and could we channel into doing these other things. In a sense, if we had a vision, it was to make this more than a game, which in some ways sometimes seems, I don't know, trite, but I promise you, if you could get in the heads today of the people trying to organize the New York, New Jersey Super Bowl, they've spent a lot of time in Indianapolis looking at what we did and how we did it. I don't have a clue how they could do this. It's, you know, it's a vast jurisdiction. It's not like there's a huge community spirit in New York, let alone New Jersey where the game is. It's different, right? I'm not trying to be negative, but this idea that, that we could be doing this for us and figure out how to leverage benefits for our community is essentially why we do it. It is not because, you know, I follow the NFL, I'm a sports fan, and there's a lot of people involved who are sports fans, but we don't do these big things in Indianapolis because we're wild about what happens inside the lines, or of course we care much about the game or the score, even if we don't say that in front of the NFL, and I'm sure this tape isn't really on, right? We do it because we think there are ways to add huge benefits, and some of them over time, to the community's development. And so more than a game really becomes kind of the vision for it. And so with that, let me just segue from kind of mission and vision to 4 goals. These were kind of the 4 big goals in no particular order. The first I just touched on, legacy. We spent a lot of time, the legacy idea is, what can we leave behind that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the sport? And in the Pan Am Games, it was a bunch of sports venues because we needed them. We didn't have a natatorium or a track and field stadium, and et cetera, et cetera. We really didn't have to build much of anything new for the Super Bowl. So what's the legacy? What can we do? When we were bidding, getting ready, we held town hall medias and we ramped up all kinds of social media conversations. The broadcast media got into it. We're looking for ideas. And in the end, there were a few, but the one that became kind of the signature legacy project was a little weird. I'll talk about it more perhaps in a minute. It was to adopt a near downtown depressed neighborhood and to see how far we could get them when the broader community partnered with the leaders of the neighborhood in their own revitalization. So we'll talk more about that in a second. The second big goal I've mentioned really, it's to engage as many people as possible. You could do this with 40 employees working full-time for 2 or 3 or 4 years and run it like a private business and probably pull it off. But our ethos, the way we think about this in Indianapolis is very different. We think one of the major benefits is the lift of morale, for lack of the right word, that the whole population feels when they all get excited about something, when thousands of people work together on something for which they don't get a nickel. Almost everybody involved didn't get anything out of it, except they felt like they were contributing to something bigger than themselves for some public good. And when that works, it's a really powerful thing that I think has effect in a community for years following the event. So that's why we wanted to do it, and in fact, we wanted to see how far we could take it around the state and not just make it the Indianapolis metropolitan area. As a subset of that, but I thought it was so important it became one of the 4 goals, we wanted to use this opportunity to not just use, we had 36,000 volunteers for the Pan Am Games in 1987. It's hard to imagine, frankly. But this time around, we knew we could find any number of volunteers to do all that needed to be done. We wanted to make a special effort to find young professionals, young folks, up-and-comers, and particularly diverse young people, and give them leadership positions in this. So that was evident at lots of levels. One of them was the committee chairs, where something like almost 50%, 40-some% of the committee co-chairs were kind of first-timers. They had done other things in the community perhaps, or in their firms, in their businesses, but they had not led civic efforts. And we thought that was particularly important because when this was over, they'll do another one and another one. And it might not be sports, it might be church or Little League or whatever it is. But it's absolutely true when people have a successful experience like this civically, they get engaged and it pays off for the kind of social fabric of the community. And finally, and this is the one that's sort of, in retrospect, maybe easiest to get, there was this goal of just blowing away the NFL. You know, however low the bar was, whatever their expectations of us, we wanted them to leave going, wow, unbelievable. And the more we thought about it, we thought, well, that's the league, and that's cool, because we might want to do this again. But really, we want our visitors to feel the same way, whether they're football fans from the Super Bowl cities. And we wanted us to feel that way, our own folks, the people who live in the city and state, to feel just really proud of it. So this simply says, well, there's only one way to do that, and it's perform. And you'll know at the end of the day whether you pulled it off. So some challenges other than the ones I've mentioned. It's largely unknown. We'll get into that, and I'll give you a couple of examples in just a second. So planning for something that is really variable is hard. It's complicated. We needed to define these meaningful roles if we were really going to get a lot of people involved, including the committee management, which I've talked about. The whole budget thing is not just making a budget, but we've built this far-flung organization with 180 like business units, committee chairs. Well, how do you make sure that they spend according to a budget? What are the controls? What are the processes? In 1987, you didn't even have computers, so that was a mess. It was very hard to do. Today, it's a lot easier, but it still requires a lot of attention to the process. A challenge was especially the logistics around our condensed urban footprint, and really just we challenged ourselves to be creative and do it differently, to do it in a way that would be unique to Indianapolis. So the unknown, I'll just give you two. You probably weren't paying this much attention, but if you're NFL fans, you know that there was the threat of a lockout. There was a lockout, and there was the real possibility there wouldn't even be a Super Bowl because there wouldn't be a season. And they didn't actually get it together until July of 2011. So what's that, 6 months or so before our Super Bowl. Now we know we've got one. We really never believed that they'd blow off the whole season. So intellectually and emotionally, we just said that's not going to happen. We keep going. But the hard part was they required us in bidding, because they knew this could happen, to save 2 dates. So we had to save every hotel room around in a block for 2 consecutive weekend dates, really 4-day periods, knowing that only one of them was going to get used. That's a really fun conversation to have with your hotel owners. But it worked out. They cooperated, and in fact, there was a game on and it was the first date, which is what most were relying on. Weather's another variable, obviously. As it turned out, it was really variable. It was completely different than anybody would have expected. We expected, because we could look back and see the data over years, that over a 10-day period, which was the period we ran the village downtown, kind of the operational period for the Super Bowl, we would have all the weather. In any given 10-day period in past years, you had rain, sleet, and ice, snow, a little bit of warm, not so warm, but kind of warm weather. So we made the decision early on that we were going to have this fun, downtown, compact, outdoor festival. It wasn't exactly brilliant. What else were we going to do? If it was not so nice weather and we had all these visitors, we're going to have them shut in downtown and, just bellying up in bars and not really doing anything. So, we've been to Winter Olympics. There were models.